I hope you like my little setup today. I tried to make myself look like a student because that's who I'm trying to target with this video. Yeah. Anyway, if you're wondering like what kind of scenario this is, you can just pretend that I'm your Zoom classmate and we're like reading econs together. I don't know. I've been reading a lot of econs books to the point where I kind of feel like, you know, I'm studying my own econs course right now, even though I've never ever touched a single econs class in my life. Anyway, today we are gonna do a really fun video, and that is a non-fiction reader, i.e. me, recommends you 5 obscure novels I think you should read. And the main reason for doing this video is because I watch a lot of you booktubers out there, and even I know that a lot of the books that you recommend are great, and I sincerely wish to pick up a lot of those books myself in the future. I was kind of inspired by all these booktubers that were doing like the year-end wrap-up, like, you know, reading what other booktubers thought were their favorite book. One of the most popular examples is probably Jack, who did a whole video on the top books that the internet recommended. And you know, there was only one non-fiction there, but more than that, regretfully, there were just so many novels that I felt I couldn't really relate to, and I felt like I didn't want to read another story of someone coming of age in New York City. No offense to the city, I think it's an interesting city, but as someone who has grown up in Singapore and has family in Southeast Asia, I don't really aspire to that kind of storyline that takes place in a place that's so far away from me. This is hot chocolate, by the way. I almost poured myself a drink, but then I realized this is a video that I want minors to be watching, so I can't have that. So that's why I am doing today's video, which is a non-fiction reader recommending obscure novels, and by this I mean novels that are from Asia. But no, that's not good. Because of who I am, right? I tend to seek out authors that are Asian in a Southeast Asian sense, but also Asian as in like they are from wherever they are from. So if you are an Indian author, then I would want to seek out a novel that's based in India and not one that's like based in some other place, or at least it's written from the perspective of someone that is closer to me in identity. I don't know why I'm struggling so much with saying this. I think that's the thing that a lot of usual readers on the internet don't really struggle with, because like any novel that you pick up in the bookstore would usually have someone that looks like you know, someone that's maybe Asian American or white, like in America, going to high school, and that's so easy to find in your shelves. And that's what most of our shelves are like now. Even in the Asian category, most of the fiction are Korean or Japanese translated literature, which is a lot closer than reading about someone in New York City. But it still isn't, you know, Southeast Asian. It still isn't, you know, it's not everything in Asia is East Asian. So I hope that the books that I recommend to you today, I hope that some of you will pick them up, because they are honestly really good. If you just set aside the whole like minority representation thing, I do think that these novels are a great pick by themselves, and I hope that you're not reading them just to diversify your shelves, but if you are, then it might be great to start from these areas, but we'll see. Yeah, I'm gonna start with 2 YA novels, and I have these right here. The very first book I want to explain here is The Hunter's Walk by Nabeel Ismeer, and this is a really interesting kind of prehistoric story that has themes of racism and I guess tribalism, misogyny to some extent. A dark-skinned cave boy's world collapses when his fair-skinned brother is expelled from the tribe. Will they ever complete their rite of passage, the Hunter's Walk? Will they ever find its true meaning? Okay, the whole thing is really long, so let me just read the last paragraph. Can Kaur and Mai push back on tribalism and exclusion by being inclusive and willing to take on foreign ideas? Will Kaur ever meet Dune and the Fairskins again? Will they ever complete the Hunter's Walk? And it takes place in a world where people are in tribes and people are kind of figuring out how to make do with the scarcity of their resources, but also in light of climate disasters and a lot of things changing in the environment. And let me just change the little filter here. Is this filter better? I don't know. I struggled a little bit to get into the book at the start because it was such a world building intensive book. So there was a lot of care given into like each of the characters. What I really enjoyed about this book, it was a pretty straightforward book, and I mentioned this a lot on my channel. I really like straightforward writing, whether that be in non-fiction or in fiction. I just like it when authors present you an idea, and the idea stands on its own, and it's an idea worth expressing. There's this whole very clear interwovenness of like racism, and also about like standing together as a community to fight against disaster. And I really like the very clear theme of how diversity was always seen to be a lot more of a strength than division, and that division in the face of disaster will only spell more disaster. And I think for that, as a YA novel, it is something that is a good message to give, especially in today's like climate environment and scenario and everything. Overall, I thought it was a pretty interesting read, and I would really recommend it for those of you who really like this kind of fantasy world building exercise and you like a good kind of hero story. I feel like that's the base of everything in this novel. And the second book here is written by a Malaysian author, and this is actually a kind of recounting of the racial riots between the Malays and Chinese back in the 1960s in Kuala Lumpur. It did also happen in Singapore. Racial riots did happen in Singapore as well, but as far as I know, I don't think there are a lot of novels written about it. I think maximum like 5 books that were written about this era. The author also included a certain condition that the main character had, which is a condition that's similar to OCD, but it wasn't formally diagnosed as such inside the novel, although the author did put a disclaimer at the front of the novel to say that there are indications that this main protagonist was struggling with OCD and struggling with certain mental disorders, and so that was like a really central theme in the whole book. I would say it's a great read, very comparable to like The Boy in the Striped Pajamas. I read that like a long time ago, but there is a very similar vibe to that, where it is really kind of that young innocent person being caught in the crossfires, like moments of courage and moments of victory and things like that against the backdrop of such like horrific events, and the grief that comes with this sudden loss and like people kind of being implicated. The synopsis for this is: Melati Ahmad has imagined her mother's death countless times. Plagued by gruesome thoughts she believes are put into her head by a jinn, Melati has developed an intricate set of tapping rituals to tame the monster within and keep her mother safe. But there are things that Melati can't protect her mother from. On the evening of May 13, 1969, racial tensions in her home city of Kuala Lumpur boil over. The Chinese and Malays are at war, and Mel and her mother become separated by a city in flames. With a 24-hour curfew in place and all lines of communication down, it will take the help of a Chinese boy named Vincent and all the courage and grit in Melati's arsenal to overcome the violence on the streets, her own prejudices, and her jinn's surging power, and to make it back to the one person she can't risk losing. Fantastic story, 100% would recommend it, and especially for those of you that find it hard to get into like a novel. Actually, I would recommend it as a good weekend read, honestly. I read it in like one day. Did I say 2 days earlier? I read it, okay, it was about a day. Okay, now it is time to move on to the adult novels. So please, minors, be careful, you've been warned. These books are, a bit more messy ish, and for those of you who are here for Literature Class 101 with your fellow friend Nat, welcome. Let's get started on our book club. The very first book I want to talk about is a book that I mentioned before. Oh no, IU, don't fall. The very first book I want to recommend in the more adult novel situation is Beauty is a Wound by Kurniawan. So I did talk about this book in the books that generally changed my life, and I chose that book because it is a fantastic historical fiction take on Indonesia's past, but also a kind of like author's reckoning with like Indonesia's contemporary identity. I thought it was such a genius book overall, and I felt like it was nothing like I read before. Obviously, this book was translated, so I've not read it in its original language. I do think it will read differently in Bahasa than in English. It combines a lot of the kind of folklorish storytelling methods and formats of traditional stories, but with all these modern backdrops and all these kind of colonial influences, and not necessarily in a good way. And what I loved the most about this novel was that it had this really strong woman as a protagonist, and beauty as her strength, but also her greatest weakness. And I thought to have a man who's an author, I mean the author is a man, to have such an author write about a woman in such a strong way and in such a complex way, it was just so refreshing for me. I think for a lot of Asian literature, I mean, people might often read Korean or Japanese translated literature, so I think that's like the most of the books that you see internationally. Most of them are things like Han Kang, or like this author called Maiko, the one with the breast and the egg cover. The women in these stories tend to be complex as well, but they all tend to follow quite closely to what East Asian women kind of stereotypes might be in their respective societies, whereas I think women across the whole of Asia are considered to be very, very different. And especially in Southeast Asia, I do think women do take on a really powerful role and a very strong mythical presence in a lot of traditional storytelling in a way that I don't think East Asian cultures would be similar in that depiction. So when I read this book, it really made me realize, like, wow, okay, Southeast Asia is a region that I am familiar with but have never really seen being represented in a novel format, or I've never really sort of read it, but I have experienced it through like my parents telling me stories, or the news, or like the way that things would be framed around me. But this was a novel that really changed that perspective for me. Kurniawan's writing is just so fantastic. It really is a great blend of pulp action, but also really like great character development and pacing of story, and it just feels like a huge action movie. I feel like it is something that is very entertaining, humorous at times, but it makes the characters so full in a way that is so satisfying that I don't see in a lot of other novels. The beautiful Indonesian prostitute Dewi Ayu and her 4 daughters are beset by incest, murder, bestiality, rape, insanity, monstrosity, and often the vengeful undead. Kurniawan's gleefully grotesque hyperbole functions as a scathing critique of his young nation's troubled past. The rapacious offhand greed of colonialism, the chaotic struggle for independence, the 1965 mass murders of perhaps 1 million communists, followed by 3 decades of Suharto's despotic rule. So, I mean, that didn't really talk anything about the novel. The next book I have here is The Man with the Compound Eyes by Wu Ming-Yi. So this book is by Taiwanese author, so it was traditionally published in Chinese, and it follows a kind of like speculative fiction format with different perspectives that you follow in the book. So you're not just reading from like a first person perspective. When you take into account like translation, oftentimes in translation it doesn't flow so well in the translated language, and I think that's completely fine, because I do think that the way that Chinese, the language works, can have a very different cadence and different impact when it's being written in that native language. What I enjoyed about this novel was that it was really, really, really expansive. Like, it really took into account so many different areas and so many different facets. It was more of like a very setting-based novel, and it was a very kind of like the environment, like the setting was like the main character in this novel. I read a lot of nonfiction because it's like one of the clearest way to talk about something as complex as the climate crisis, whereas this novel is great in showing how the environment, the animals, the non-human beings all had equal agency to the humans that were in this novel. So that's what I really, really liked about Wu Ming-Yi's writing, is that like he wrote from a very environmentalist point of view, and because of that he paid so much attention to so many of these non-human beings that I think other novelists wouldn't really care about. Like, they would describe a tree just because it was part of the backdrop. If you're someone that likes a bit more of a fantastical but mixed with reality, I think it's called like, what's it called? Magical realism? But if you're someone that's into more of that genre and you want to actually read a Taiwanese author, or you want to read kind of like a very interesting novel, I would recommend this book quite strongly. Now, the very, 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 very last book I have here is Erotic Stories for Punjabi Widows by Balli Jaswal. So Balli Jaswal is author based in Singapore, but she writes from like a Punjabi diasporic perspective in this book. So out of all the books that I've been recommending here, this is like the only one that is set outside of the country of like origin. Okay, that is a very loose term because I don't think there's such a thing as like country of origin per se. I myself identify as a member of like a diasporic community here in Singapore. I really like the fact that this was a diasporic experience that was told through the lens of like a young woman, as someone who grew up overseas and sees through her eyes how the women in her community have been dealing with their own secret issues that she never thought of questioning. Every woman has a secret life. When Nikki takes a teaching job at her local temple with visions of emancipating the women of the community, she's shocked to discover a group of barely literate women who have no interest in her ideals. Yet to her surprise, the white dupattas of the widows hide more than just their modesty. These are women who have spent their lives being dutiful, raising children and going to temple, but whose inner lives are as rich and fruitful as their untold stories. As they open up to each other, Nikki realizes that the illicit nature of the class may place them all in danger. I thought it was just going to be like a really fun, entertaining read at the start of it, but there is a bit of like a hidden mystery action-packed plot at the end of it. So that is really fun and interesting. I didn't expect that at all. What the author did an amazing job on was really developing all the characters so well. I think for her, like, the characters were a lot more important than the setting itself. I think her other novels probably spent a lot more time on the setting, but in this one, it was really about all these different women, and that is such an important perspective that I have not really read about. It's like the first generation women that have migrated for their families, because it's so true that I think when we think about like diasporic women, that can be a lot of very complicated feelings, but at the end of the day, this community is what is so important for everyone, that you really need to have an open sense of vulnerability when it comes to coming together as a community in a foreign land. And I know that these communities tend to be like hated on so much, and I know that I've experienced that kind of hostility before, but at the same time, it is so heartwarming to see how they all come together and how they have carved out a space, like a spot in the society for themselves, and that they could be unapologetically themselves without having to let go of their own identity and to say that, yeah, I am this person, I am still me in this new land, I have my family, I have my cultures, I have my traditions, and I can have my friends here. And I think that's such a powerful message that I absolutely loved. And also, be warning, a huge warning, as the title suggests, there are actual erotic stories inside this novel. So if you suddenly just come across some smut in this novel, it's not just implied. There are actually excerpts of sex stories, so please be careful when you're reading this book, because I was really shocked when I saw some of those excerpts. I was like, whoa, these would really be wilded. Okay, so that's it. Those are the 5 books that I want to recommend for you all. Please pick these books. I am trying my best to insert myself into the whole fiction reading world of BookTube, so I hope you like my attempt. I have pretty high standards for fiction, because representation really matters a lot to me, and I'm not gonna read a book where like the story is great but the characters don't matter to me, or like the story itself doesn't reflect the things I care about. Like, I'm not gonna spend my time reading books that don't do that for me. I hope that some of these books will be great for some of you, especially for those of you that have always been reading like the top few books that everyone is recommending. I do hope that perhaps you would challenge yourself to diversify your reads. And I think for all of you that are from Southeast Asia, or you're from Asia and you're watching this video, I do hope that you pick some of these books up and really enjoy them the same way that I did, because of the characters, the setting, the kind of relatability of these stories, and how different they are from the standard like top novels that everyone seems to be talking about. And I do think it's worth spreading these titles a lot more, like these kinds of books a lot more. If you've read any of these books, let me know in the comments below what you thought about them. I would like to know so much. And thank you so much for recommending The Weight of Our Sky. That viewer, let me go and find you, but I absolutely loved it so much, so thank you so much for recommending that book to me. Okay, that's it from me. Thanks so much for joining me here today, and I'll see you in the next video. I think this is so weird. I'll see you in the next video, and till then, please do take care. Yeah, please. Wait, I can't even function. It's like so late at night right now. But please take care. Have a good night's rest, and I'll see you in the next video. Relax and recharge. Thanks for joining me, and thanks for always watching. And stay safe. Take care. Drink lots of water, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye. Wait, I need to cut this. Okay, my hot chocolate is no longer hot, it is just lukewarm.